So we're gonna get started. Um, we have over the course of the last year put together a four-part lecture series that we're going to continue, and we did some we've done some reflection along the way. And one of the things that we found out in surveying and talking to people was that they got a lot of entertainment from Dr. Akbar. Uh, but we also found out that there was a real value in entertainment. And then we took some parents away a week ago, and one of the parents who was there at the training session on how to organize home and school associations and others, she had been there when we had Dr. Akbar, and she felt entertained the first time. But in the course of going through training, a light went off in her head that is very beautiful to see. And I think that she was able to look at the tape with different eyes. If you remember, Dr. Akbar talked about the topic Power for Education. And he talked about the visible curriculum and the invisible curriculum. And we went from there to Wade Nobles, and Wade Nobles talked about educating for eternity. And if some of you all were there, you remember Wade made it real clear that if our aim is to educate folk to have a job, then we start with one set of assumptions. But if our aim is to educate for eternity, then we start with a totally different set of assumptions. And we then had in Adelaide Sanford, who kind of filled in some of the blanks for us. And the one telling thing about Dr. Sanford's lecture was how she talked about Nurse Ruth. And I saw some lights go off in some folks' head, and we haven't forgotten that. But moving along, we are now going to start getting down to brass tacks. And our guest tonight is somebody that will give us another perspective that will just add on to what we already have. I won't give away the topic, but some of you all, we've engaged in dialogue, and you've heard a little bit about Dr. Carruthers. I won't go into all his distinguished honors, and there are many. I'll ask you that we not look for entertainment tonight, that we listen very closely, and we recognize that the value of the lecture series is not having individual scholars in, although that's part of it. It's what we do with the tapes once we have them, and how we augment them with reading materials and practical application that will enable us over the course of time to transform our school. There was a monumental event that we think happened today in the life of Fulton School, and we won't go into it a lot except to say that there was a growth that resulted in a process being put in place for the committee that is going to be implementing the African-centered curriculum. I think it's very fitting that we struggled together for a long time and did some reflection and came up with a process that hopefully will result in the kind of outcomes that we all desire. I could go on and on and on, but that really wouldn't give you the essence of why we're here tonight. I came to know Dr. Carruthers about a year ago. I had read a lot about him. I had listened to him on tape, but Uh, I actually got to watch him up close and personal about a year ago. And I think that it's very, very important that we spend some time thinking about what the intent of the educational system is. There are those of us who believe that the system as it's presently designed is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And I think tonight Dr. Carruthers will hopefully give us some information that will allow us to kind of see if what I'm saying has balance to it or not. Let me introduce to you all so that we can get to the meat of it. A good friend, a general, and an elder, and someone who I think you will all learn a lot from, Dr. Jacob Carruthers.
First of all, let me greet you with the divine words, Yem Hotep. May you come in peace. Greetings and welcome. I'd like to thank you so very much for inviting me to Philadelphia and the Fulton School. It's always a great honor and pleasure for me to come to engage in a conversation with fellow educators and parents, especially about matters that are so vital to the interest of our children. So I'm flattered that you invited me here to participate in this event. And I hope that we all can engage in a constructive dialogue about a few issues that I want to raise with you this evening. I would like to commend you for your commitment to the project of African-centered education. I think that that is probably the most significant moment facing education at the present time. And the outcome of this great event will determine to a large extent how successfully we're going to be able to negotiate the 21st century. So again, let me commend you for your commitment to moving in the direction of the African-centered system of education. I would like to bring you greetings from the Center for Inner City Studies, which is a part of Northeastern Illinois University where I work. We are all excited at the center by this African-centered movement. We consider ourselves to be pioneers in that movement. We started out 27 years ago with an African-centered approach to education, and over the years we have had some lean company. Sometimes we couldn't get over 2 or 3 people in the room to kick around the ideas, but here in the last few years, things have been picking up, and not only in Chicago and around the center, but all over the country. And so we're just overjoyed that this movement now has gained some momentum. So welcome, welcome to all of us. Also bring you greetings from the Kemetic Institute, an organization that I have devoted a great deal of my time to. It's made up of many of our former students who came through the center, and after they finished, they came back and challenged us and said, let's try to implement some of those ideas you are talking about in class. And So in defense, we established the Kemetic Institute, and we have a fine group of younger women and men who are dedicating their time, energy, and what could be called their fortunes to the carrying out of this great educational mission. So all of us in our little family wish you well in what you're doing, and let us know whether we can help you at all, and please come to Chicago and help us, whatever the case. I'd like to talk about the African-centered curriculum and the white supremacy control of African and African-American education. First of all, I would like to just simply look at the roots of the African-centered curriculum approach, and then I would like to summarize the problem to which the African-centered educational thrust speaks, the problem of white supremacy and historicide against African people. Then I would like to outline the development of what I call Negro education and trace its rise and fall. And then finally, I would like to make a few comments about the current situation, especially in terms of prospects, that is, what can and perhaps is likely to occur as we enter the 21st century. As I implied in my overview, the roots of this African-centered education thrust are deeply embedded in the history of this country and of Africans in the diaspora. Those Africans who were brought from the continent of Africa into this country over the years. In fact, we can go back over 200 years during the period of the formation of this country, and we can find the roots of African-centered education. We can find it in the thoughts of people like Reverend Richard Allen, who founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church. We can find it in the thought of Absalom Jones. We can find it in the writings and the speeches of Prince Hall, who founded the African Lodge. We can find it in the activities of Paul Cuffey, who led the first group of Africans in the United States back to the continent of Africa, looking for a better solution to the problems that they confronted. These pioneers, as we may call them, these thinkers were beginning to put together a strategy for dealing with one of the most vicious intellectual campaigns that has ever been unleashed on humanity, and that is the campaign of philosophical white supremacy and historicide against African people. That is the killing of the history of a people, or the attempt to kill the history of a people. That project, initiated by those African pioneers under the most difficult circumstances, while most of our ancestors were in the throes of the chattel slave system, was indeed an admirable project. And they laid the project out, and they started the battle that we are still engaged in. But they did an excellent job of pointing us in the right direction. And in order to understand where we are now, we have to understand that history. Let me read a couple of statements from David Walker, who was an admirer of the generation of African thinkers that I was talking about, Richard Allen and Paul Cuffey. David Walker in 1828 wrote an appeal addressing all of the Africans in the world, not just those in North America, not just the slaves, but every African in the world. David Walker addressed his appeal to, and insisted in that appeal that every African have at the top of his or her agenda the total liberation of African people from the oppression that was almost universal in his day against African people. Here's something he said in the introduction to that appeal that's very important. Some of my brethren do not know who Pharaoh and the Egyptians were. I know it to be a fact that some of them take the Egyptians to have been a gang of devils, not knowing any better, and that they, the Egyptians, having got possession of the Lord's people, treated them nearly as cruel as Christian Americans do us at the present day. For the information of such, I would only mention that the Egyptians were Africans, such as we are, about the same as you see the colored people of the United States at the present day. That was 1828, laying out one of the fundamental premises of the African-centered curriculum. And then he went on to say this, that all African people, all people of African ancestry, should take a retrospective view of the arts and sciences, the wise legislators, the pyramids and other magnificent buildings, the turning of the channel of the river Nile by the sons of Africa, among whom learning originated and was carried thence unto Greece. Now why, you may ask, would David Walker, who was joining the fight to dismantle the chattel slave system, why would he take the time in such an important document as his appeal to point out that the ancient Egyptians were black people or African people, and that all African people, as they began to put together a strategy for dismantling the chattel slave system, must study African antiquity, must go back to that African antiquity. Why, you may ask, did he think that was necessary? Well, bear that question in mind. 20 years after Walker wrote his appeal, and I might point out that the next year Walker was killed because of that appeal. 20 years later, Henry Highland Garnett, another African-American leader in the antebellum period, sort of explained the problem that Walker was dealing with. And here's what he said. By an almost common consent, the modern world seems determined to pilfer Africa of her glory. It were not enough that her children have been scattered over the globe, clothed in the garments of shame, humiliated and oppressed, but her merciless foes weary themselves in plundering the tombs of our renowned sires and obliterating their worthy deeds, which were inscribed by fame on the pages of ancient history. In other words, what Garnett was referring to was this great campaign that I was talking about, and that is the campaign to elevate the concept of white supremacy to the position of a philosophical principle and the campaign to destroy the history of African people. From that early beginning, this African-centered thrust continued. Brave thinkers and speakers, in the face of the chattel slave system, in the face of bodily threats, in the face of assassinations like David Walker, they continued to preach the truth about the African heritage as a necessary part of liberation. The idea that African people cannot be totally liberated until the African mind is liberated. I don't care how much you change the institutions, until the African mind is liberated, you cannot totally liberate African people. And they preached that doctrine. After this generation, you had Martin Delany, you had Edward Wilmot Blyden, you had Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, you had, going into the 20th century, you had W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Leo Hansberry, Drusilla Dungy Houston, a great African-American woman. You had Marcus Garvey. You had George G.M. James and Sheikh Anta Diop, an African on the coast, on the continent of Africa. You had, of course, Malcolm X. And then you had our great elders, Chancellor Williams and Ben Yakinen and John Henry Clark, who have all, you know, carried out this heritage, have presented us with this heritage, have handed it down generation to generation as a necessary part of our liberation strategy, criticizing the broad American curriculum. One of the great moments, however, in this struggle is the moment that was ushered in by what we call the black students of the 1960s. And perhaps some of you were a part of that great revolutionary group. Starting in February of 1960, the black students started what was called the sit-in movement. From the sit-in movement, they went to the voter registration drive. And that campaign that they waged was so significant and so impelling that white students all over this country came to the South to learn what the black students were doing and to learn something about this country that they perhaps didn't know. And they went back to their universities and began to transform education in this country. The decade of the 60s is really the decade of the black students, because the black students really undertook and negotiated a great deal of change. The impact that they had on many, many things. One of the great impacts of that movement was the revival in 1976 of the revolution in South Africa that had been so depressed after Nelson Mandela had been put in the penitentiary. But because of the inspiration of the black students here in this country, people like Steve Biko were able to revive that revolution in South Africa. But the point that I want to get to in terms of this black student revolution is that they are the ones who raised the banner of black studies. Because as they went further and further into the business of trying to change this country and trying to dismantle the segregation system, they discovered more and more that the liberation of the mind of the African was absolutely essential for what they were trying to accomplish. It couldn't stop with just changing the laws in the South. It couldn't stop with just changing certain institutional arrangements. It had to result in the liberation of the African mind, because what they discovered when desegregation set in, and the few places where desegregation was attempted in some sense or another, what they found is that they had another problem. That is, even though they were going to the same schools that the white children were going to, they found that they were confronted with a curriculum of white supremacy that was even more devastating than the physical segregation system that they had been exposed to. And so black studies then was a real challenge to the white supremacy curriculum. And black studies has inherent in it the demand that that curriculum be overthrown. Black studies had a great impact on education in the 1960s, and that impact is seen today in terms of ethnic studies, in terms of women's studies, in terms of innovative education, and so forth and so on. We see all of that as a result of the black studies revolution. But one of the big problems that we are confronting today is that the black studies movement finally spawned what is called multiculturalism. And it seems as though multiculturalism should be an ally to the black studies movement. But as a matter of fact, many of the exponents of multiculturalism use multiculturalism as a device to destroy black studies. They say, you know, now that we have multiculturalism, we don't need black studies anymore because multiculturalism does it all. Well, not yet. Not yet. And so what we then have done, carrying out that necessary struggle, is wound up with a new phase of that struggle that has the name the African-centered education movement. That's where we are now, moving ahead, still with the intent of dismantling the curriculum of white supremacy. Let me now step back into history a little bit more, because we have to look at that curriculum of white supremacy. We have to look at where it came from. The curriculum of white supremacy is deeply embedded in the curriculum philosophy itself. It goes under the guise of Western civilization. And so it's hard to detect, because every time you see it presented in its Sunday dress, it calls itself Western civilization. But when you take the Sunday robe off and you begin to probe it, what you discover is something that is much less appealing than Western civilization. And what it says, what it is really, underneath that robe is white supremacy. Excuse my language. Excuse my language, but I don't know any way to identify this horrendous disease except by its name, white supremacy. As I see it, the doctrine of white supremacy as a philosophical concept came into existence sometimes in the middle of the 18th century. Now that may seem surprising, because the chattel slave system had been going on then for 3 centuries. And a lot of people believe that that white supremacy is synonymous with the chattel slave system. I don't want to go into all of the intricate developments within the modern era, because we don't have time. That's a course in itself. But let me just point out that if you read the history, the intellectual history of the Western world, I think you will agree with me that it's quite likely that the doctrine of white supremacy in terms of a philosophical thrust was really a product of the thinking of certain of the great thinkers of the Western world in the 18th century. One was Charles Montesquieu, perhaps the most well-known of the ones who put forth this doctrine was Montesquieu. Montesquieu's book, The Spirit of the Laws, is a part of the great books that are still considered to be the greatest group of books in the world, the great books of the Western world. His Spirit of the Laws is required reading in many of the colleges and universities. It's a part of the humanities course in many universities. People have to know about it. It was one of the great influences on the minds of the people who wrote the Constitution of the United States a couple of hundred years ago. Charles Montesquieu, in that book, published in 1749, he has a chapter on Negro slavery. And here's what he says, among other things. Were I to vindicate our right to make slaves of the Negroes, these would be my arguments. The Europeans, having extirpated the Americans, were obliged to make slaves of the Africans for clearing such vast tracts of land. Sugar would be too expensive if the plants which produced it were cultivated by any other than slaves. These creatures are all over black and with such a flat nose that they can hardly be pitied. It's hard to believe that God, who is a wise being, should place a soul, especially a good soul, in such a black, ugly body. Negroes prefer glass necklaces to gold, which other nations value so highly. Can there be a greater proof of their not having common sense? It is natural to look upon color as a criterion of human nature. And finally, it's impossible for us to admit that they are men, because admitting that they are men, a suspicion would follow that we ourselves are not Christian. And I think that that gets at the real problem. In the middle of the 18th century, the chattel slave system was at its peak. The horrors of the European treatment of African people was at its greatest depth. African people were being slaughtered by the tens of thousands in that traffic. Humanity was crying out, and that slave system was giving Europeans all kinds of problems. They were giving Europeans moral problems, but primarily economic problems. Many Europeans were unemployed because they couldn't compete successfully with slave labor. But whatever the case, great thinkers like Montesquieu and his protege, a Scotsman by the name of David Hume, decided at this time that it was absolutely necessary to invent a doctrine of white supremacy in order to justify what the Europeans had done over the last 300 years. And so they put forth the mandate that Africans had to be looked at as inferior beings. Montesquieu, in really formulating this idea, provided a kind of scientific basis for understanding Africa and for dealing with Africa. In the spirit of the laws, he laid out a doctrine that human beings develop culturally according to an evolutionary scheme. And that scheme begins with savagery and ends with civilization. And furthermore, that the Europeans are the only people who have arrived at the top of that developmental scheme historically. And what he said about Africans is this: the greatest part of the people of Africa are savages and barbarians. They are without industry or arts. They have gold in abundance, which they receive immediately from nature. Every civilized state is therefore in a condition to traffic with them to advantage by raising their esteem for things of no value and receiving a very high price in return. In other words, it's all right to exploit Africans because they are backward people. This is a point, this is a part of the rationale for the doctrine of white supremacy. The problem with that doctrine, and Montesquieu is just one of the exponents of it, there are others, we don't have time to read all of them. But the problem with that doctrine, as Montesquieu put it forth in the middle of the 18th century, was that the Greeks, who they admired so much, and who they felt that they owed their intellectual origins to, had already denied the thesis. And that is, the Greeks thought so much of the ancient Africans, especially the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Ethiopians. And so that was a big problem, because what you had was a kind of disbelief on the part of some Europeans that Africans could really be considered to be inferior to Europeans because of their ancient reputation. So that was a problem. For example, Aristotle had said, it's no new or even recent discovery of political science that the state should be divided into classes. To this day, it's the case in Egypt. In Egypt, the system is believed to have been introduced by the legislation of Sesostris. The division into classes originated in Egypt. Egypt bears witness to the antiquity of political institutions. Her people are recognized as the most ancient of all races, and from time out of mind, they've had a legal code and a regular system of government. We ought therefore to make good use of what has come down to us from the past and merely try to supplement its defects. In other words, Aristotle thought a great deal of the ancient Africans. Not only Aristotle, but all of the people of antiquity, on down to the modern era, the early modern era, a century and a half before Montesquieu launched his attack. You had people like Sir Isaac Newton praising the ancient Africans. Here's what Sir Isaac Newton said in 1620 about the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians were early observers of the heavens, and from them philosophy was spread among other nations. From them and the nations about them, the Greeks, a people more addicted to the study of philology than of nature, derived their first as well as soundest notions of philosophy. In other words, that problem of civilization in ancient Africa had in some way or another to be overcome if this doctrine of white supremacy was going to stand. And so what you found was that in the 20th century, the great thinker of that century, perhaps the most influential thinker of that century, Hegel, a German, provided the solution to the problem. Hegel said this, that the Negro in Africa exhibits the natural man in his completely wild and untamed state. There is nothing harmonious with humanity to be found in this type of character. Then Hegel went on to conclude that the condition of Africans is capable of no developmental culture, and that enslavement to more advanced Europeans is necessary to the increase of human feelings among the Negroes and is an advance toward becoming participants in a higher morality. And then after 9 pages of analyzing Africa in that vein, he closed out his discussion of Africa this way. At this point, we leave Africa, not to mention it again, for it is not a historical part of the world. It has no movements or development to exhibit. Historical movements in it, that is, in its northern part, belong to the Asiatic or European world. Egypt will be considered in reference to its western phase, but it does not belong to the African spirit. What we properly understand by Africa is the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit still involved in the conditions of mere nature, and which had to be presented here only as on the threshold of world history. Now that's the solution to the problem that Hegel offered. That is, first of all, take Egypt out of Africa. Secondly, take Africans out of Egypt. And thirdly, take Africans out of history. Once you do that, you don't have to worry about Africa anymore. Africa really is fortunate that the Europeans are exploiting it, because otherwise Africans would never get out of savagery. That is the solution. That was 1820. That's not a long time ago, you know. And this idea that Hegel put forth, while it's very blatant and very open, more or less determined the context of the treatment of Africa ever since that time. Africa has been more or less relegated to the position of the most primitive level of human existence ever since. Through the 19th century, into the 20th century, down to the present time. What we find is that in the middle of the 19th century, Count Joseph Gobineau wrote a book called The Inequality of the Human Races. And in that book, he laid out the hierarchy of races, starting with the Nordics, who are the whitest of white, coming down the line to the bottom, the African black who is on the bottom. That idea is the idea that was adopted, of course, by Adolf Hitler. And it has been a part of the thinking of many of the social thinkers in the 20th century, the idea of the hierarchy of the races. In the same year that Gobineau put out The Inequality of the Human Races, another European by the name of Thomas Carlyle, you may have heard of him, wrote a pamphlet called The Nigger Question. Published that pamphlet in London, and in that pamphlet he criticized the British government for abolishing slavery. In 1832 the British had abolished slavery. In 1850 Carlyle criticized them and pointed out that they were going to have to reintroduce slavery because the only relationship that can exist between Africans and Europeans is a relationship of slavery. That was what Carlyle said in 1850. Needless to say, in the southern part of the United States, Carlyle and Gobineau's works were more or less the Bibles of the resistance to breaking down the slave system. But whatever the case, this idea of white supremacy worked its way into all of the intellectual disciplines that have anything to do with human relations. You can find it embedded in Freudian psychology. You can find it embedded in Durkheimian sociology. You can find it embedded in Burgess's political science. Whatever discipline you look in, as it developed in the 19th century, you find this idea of primitive Africa. So much so that the image of Africa that still exists in most people's mind, especially educated people, is what I call the pre-Lull African. Pre-Lull, pre-literate, pre-urban, and pre-logical. The primitive African. Whether you like Africans or don't like Africans, that's the image you have of them. The Africans didn't write until somebody from outside Africa came in and taught them how to write. Africans didn't live in cities until somebody came from outside and built cities for them. Africans didn't think logically. They thought superstitiously. They thought intuitively. But they didn't think logically until somebody came in and gave them a European education. And that is when Africans started entering the realm of civilization. That is the picture that we get of Africa. Just imagine if we took Greece away from Europe for a minute. Let's say that we can prove that Greece was really not a part of European culture at all. That Greece was a colony of Africans who were just a little lighter than other Africans. And that the real, authentic European culture is the culture that Aristotle discussed when he talked about the Thracians and the Scythians. That the real, authentic European culture is the culture that Tacitus discussed when he talked about the Teutonic tribes who wore animal skins and who fought all day and never worked for a loaf of bread. Let's insist that the authentic European culture is the culture that Caesar talked about when he went to Britain and saw those people with their bodies painted blue. Let's insist that there was no culture, no civilization in Europe until the Africans took civilization to them by colonizing that part of Africa, of Europe that we call Greece. Let's say we did. Whatever the case, we can say that history as we know it would be a lot different if we insisted on that. But that's what they have, these intellectuals have put on African people. And this idea continues down to the present day. This negative concept of Hegel, that Hegel put forth, is still a dominant theme in the minds of even the liberals. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who announces himself as a liberal, who says that he has always been a friend of the blacks in this country. Yes, thank you. Who asserts that he's been a part of all of the authentic intellectual development of the African-American people exploded in a little pamphlet he wrote called The Disuniting of America a couple of years ago. he was really preaching against us because somehow or another we had gotten under his skin. He said in that explosion, the West needs no lectures on the superior virtue of these Sun people, these Africans who sustained slavery until Western imperialism abolished it, who still keep women in subjugation and cut off their clitorises, who carry out social persecutions against fellow Africans from the wrong tribe, who show themselves either incapable of operating a democracy or ideologically hostile to the democratic idea, and who in their tyrannies and massacres have stamped with utmost brutality on human rights. Democracy would find it hard to put down roots in a tribalist and patrimonial culture that long before the West invaded Africa had sacralized the personal authority of the chieftains and ordained the submission of the rest. Corruption is regarded through much of Africa as no more than the prerogative of power. Of course, you know, you can find instances of all of that in Africa and Chicago. I know not Philadelphia, of course, or Bosnia. But this sounds just like Hegel. Schlesinger's grandfather came from Germany, so maybe there's a Hegelian connection there. But what I'm saying is that this white supremacy curriculum is a part of the thinking of the educated elite in the world, and that is the problem that we are confronting. Now let me get the third strand of this little tale together, and that is Negro education. Because the doctrine of white supremacy required one characteristic to make it really work. It was not sufficient to just simply teach it to the Europeans and have the Europeans accept it. You also had to have Africans who accepted it, because it wouldn't work if the Africans rejected it. If Africans refused to be inferior, it wouldn't work. And so Negro education came about to correct that defect. In 1872, Edward Wilmot Blyden was rather prophetic as he looked at an emerging Negro education system. Edward Wilmot Blyden was a man of African ancestry who was born in the Caribbean, who came to this country as a young man seeking an education before the Civil War, couldn't get in college, and then went to Liberia and became a citizen of Liberia and remained there for the rest of his life. That is, he traveled back and forth between Europe, the United States, and Africa, but he was a Liberian citizen. He became the president of the University of Liberia, and he tried to put together an African-centered curriculum. He made this statement in 1872, which was sort of prophetic in terms of the emerging system of Negro education. He says, all educated Negroes suffer from a kind of slavery, in many ways far more subversive of the real welfare of the race than the ancient physical fetters. The slavery of the mind is far more destructive than that of the body, but such is the weakness and imperfection of human nature that many, even those who bravely fought to remove the shackles from the body of the Negro, transfer them to his mind. That was very prophetic, because at the time Blyden was thinking those thoughts, Negro education was really being put together, especially in this country. But in order to understand what was going on in this country in the 1870s, we have to go back a few centuries. We have to go back to the beginning of the chattel slave system, really. We have to go back to about 1440, 1450, 1460, 1470. We have to go back to the Portuguese invasion of Africa to start this affair. One of the things that the Portuguese did when they got into what we call Black Africa was to decide that they could better exploit Africa if they were able to take some Africans and educate them and send them back to Africa. And so the Portuguese went to some of the influential families in the area of Angola and said, listen, we would like to take some of your young men and take them to Portugal and give them a good European education. Well, the African people said, well, that sounds like a pretty good idea. We can't ever use too much education. So they sent some of their children, whose names were Nzingas, to Portugal. After about 15 years of Portuguese education, those children came back with the names of Dom Pedro. And they tore Africa up. They created so much havoc in Africa that the Portuguese were able to rip much of Africa off through using these educated Africans. Throughout the years, from the middle of the 1400s, Europeans continued to experiment with educating Africans and sending them back into Africa to advance the cause of the Europeans. So in 1872, this was not anything new. There was plenty of experience. There were plenty of cases that you could refer to see what was the right way and what wouldn't work. But in 1790, the Quakers in this country, as this country was beginning its new adventure as a white republic, decided that they were going to join in the movement to abolish chattel slavery. And as you know, the Quakers were the first organized group in this country to become abolitionists. One of their leading members was a man named Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin outlined the policy of Negro education that became the foundation for this enterprise in this country. Let me read a statement that he made to the first Congress of the United States in 1790, the first Congress of the United States. Historic occasion. In his petition to Congress, asking them to consider the abolition of slavery, he said this: slavery is such an atrocious debasement of human nature that its very expiation, if not performed with the solicitous care, may sometimes open a source of serious evils. The unhappy man who has so long been treated as a brute animal too frequently sinks beneath the common standard of the human species. Under such circumstances, freedom may often prove a misfortune to himself and a prejudice to society. Therefore, we have ventured to make an important addition to our original plan, that is, for the emancipation of slaves. That is, to instruct, to advise, to qualify those who have been restored to freedom for the exercise and enjoyment of civil liberty, to promote in them habits of industry, to furnish them with employment suited to their age, sex, talents, and other circumstances, and to procure their children an education calculated for their future situation in life. This is somewhat contrary to the notion that we get out of what we call African American history, that there was a prohibition against educating African people in this country, the slaves. What the Quakers at least were advocating is that you can't emancipate the slaves without educating them. Education has to go along with emancipation. It's in the interest of the slave and the interest of the country to educate them. That sounds like irrefutable logic. But let's see what happened. Because in 1854, the first college for African Americans was established in this state, incidentally. Ashman Institute in this state. Now it's called Lincoln. Right. 1854. Then 2 years later, one was established in your sister state, Ohio. Wilberforce, before the Civil War. And immediately after the Civil War, you had a proliferation of Negro colleges established. Howard University, Fisk, and blah, blah, just so many. By the 1890s, there were maybe 2 or 3 dozen Negro colleges in this country. Education seemed to have been one of the great answers to what my friend and colleague Anderson Thompson calls the Negro question. So much was put in this idea of educating the ex-slave that the leading educators of this country called a conference in 1890. They entitled the conference the Mohonk Conference on the Negro Question. Let me repeat it. The Mohonk Conference on the Negro Question. It was a conference that was attended by the leading white educators of this country, the presidents of the leading universities such as Harvard, the leading philanthropists, the presidents of the great foundations that had been established, the leading missionaries, the leading ministers, the leading statesmen and politicians attended this conference. There were a lot of great names, and they selected as their keynote speaker for that conference a man by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. You got it? Who had been president of the United States and who many people accuse of having sold African people down the river in 1877 when he promised the Southerners that he was going to pull the troops out of the South and let the Southerners take over and take care of their business as they wanted to. But anyway, by 1890, Rutherford B. Hayes was a friend of the Negro. He was a philanthropist, and he delivered the keynote address at the first Mohonk Conference. This, in keeping with the principles that had been laid out for Negro education in 1790, 100 years before. Think of these 90s here. We're talking about 1790 when Benjamin Franklin laid it out. Then Rutherford B. Hayes defines it in more detail in 1890, and now in 1990, what are we doing? But let's get back to Rutherford B. Hayes. Here's a statement from his speech. A century or two ago, the ancestors of the great majority of the present Negro population of the United States were African barbarians and pagans of the lowest type. They had no skill in any kind of labor, nor industrious habits, and knew nothing of any printed or written language. This heathen people, brought from the dark continent after several generations in bondage, followed by a few years of freedom, have all of them learned to understand and speak the English language. All of them have been taught the essential lesson in civilization. They can all earn their own living by their own labor. And for the next several days, these ideas were discussed. Then the conference was so intriguing that they decided they needed another one, and so in 1891 they had the second conference on the Negro question. And they met again for 3 days to wind up the business. And at the end of the second conference, they came up with this platform. I'll read 4 of the planks of the platform. The accomplishing of the primary education of the Negro by the states themselves, and the further development of means and methods to this end till all Negroes are creditably trained in primary schools. That is, in other words, education of Negroes is going to be controlled in the first instance by the states. By the states. This is after the troops have been taken out now. Secondly, the largely increased support of schools aided by private benevolence, which shall supply teachers and preachers for the Negro race. That is, the main object of education at the higher level is to train preachers and teachers for the Negro race. Preachers and teachers. If you wonder how we got the leadership. Thirdly, the grounding of the vast majority of these teachers and preachers in common English studies and in the English Bible. Now this is the culture. This is the culture. Preachers and teachers grounded in the English language and the English Bible. And fourth, the great extension of industrial education for both men and women. That is, the masses of black people will be put to work through industrial education. This was the conception of Negro education, worked out in this country. And it became the backbone of the education system that was finally brought into question by the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954. This is the kind of education, the context that those 4 black students in 1960 came out of, who went into that restaurant and started the sit-in movement and wound up in the Black Studies movement. This is the educational context out of which it came. Because this model developed through the control of the white philanthropists in this country became the model for African education all over the world. This model was worked out at Hampton Institute. The man who really put this model together was also at this conference. His name was Samuel B. Armstrong, the founder of Hampton Institute. And his favorite pupil was Booker T. Washington, who he sent to Tuskegee to imitate what he had done at Hampton. That model, the Hampton-Tuskegee model, became the model for African education. The British took it to the Gold Coast, they took it to South Africa, they took it to East Africa, they established African education after that model. In other words, if you want to understand the roots of the apartheid system, you have to look not in South Africa, but in South United States of America. That's where the model really is. That's where the model for apartheid came from. And that's where the South Africans are still looking to see how they can go from the point where they are now. I'll get back to that in a minute. But this is the education system, the Negro education system. This is the rise of the system. And we have to add what Justice John Marshall Harlan said 5 years later, in 1896, in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Now, the Plessy versus Ferguson case did not directly deal with education. It was a transportation case. It was a case testing the validity of a law segregating black people in public transportation vehicles. But it had its greatest impact in the field of education. That case was decided by a vote of 7-1-1. 7 justices upheld the segregation law. 1 justice did not participate in the decision, and 1 justice dissented. I want to look at the dissenting judge. The dissenting judge has been considered to be a hero in terms of befriending African Americans. And we may well want to treat him as a hero, but let us understand him very well. Here's one statement that he made in criticizing his colleagues who were authorizing de jure segregation. He said, you should not pass this law. You should not authorize this law. This law is an embarrassment to us. And then he went on to say, the white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country. And so it is, in prestige, in achievements, in education, in wealth, and in power. So I doubt not it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage. In other words, you don't need laws to maintain white supremacy. white supremacy will exist simply because of the position that white people occupy in this country. You don't need any laws. You don't have to act a fool and pass these horrendous laws. But his colleagues thought otherwise, and they went on and authorized the system of de jure segregation. Well, what happened to that system? Without going through all of the ups and downs of it, very simply, what happened to it is the black youth began to dismantle that system, just as black people began to dismantle the chattel slave system. You want to know what made the chattel slave system fall so rapidly? It is because 40,000 black people walked away from the plantations, and that put the nation in a crisis. You can say that, well, Abe Lincoln signed this and all that, and that's true, but you have to understand that the reason the crisis erupted in the first place is because the Southerners were losing so much of their manpower due to the self-emancipation of black people that they tried to force the nation to help them preserve the slave system, and that broke the consensus among the whites, and they began to squabble among themselves. The same thing happened to segregation. What happened is that as black children and young people began to move all over this country, the people who were in charge of education began to wonder why black education wasn't working so well, why there was so much disorder, why the children were fighting so much, why the children were disrespecting the teachers so much, and so forth and so on. And so they ordered some studies in the 1930s. The Rockefeller Foundation appropriated some money to study this phenomenon, gave it to the American Youth Commission, and they came up with a series of studies on Negro education. And what they said in 1930s in those studies was that we got to get rid of this segregated education system, because if we don't, we're going to have a revolution in this country, because we are creating a black revolutionary class, an alienated class of black people with this segregated education system. And so they began to dismantle it. World War II intervened, but they got back on the case, and finally you had the Brown versus Board of Education case. The Brown Board versus Board of Education case did not deal with the main issue. What the segregation system really was a system of white supremacy. It was only incidentally concerned with racial isolation. But Brown versus Board of Education defined segregation operationally as racial isolation. And then it created doctrines to deal with the dismantling of the system of racial isolation. But the system was not based upon racial isolation. What it was based upon was white supremacy and black inferiority. In those places where the segregation system was the most vigorously enforced, it was impossible to separate black people and white people, like Landis County, Alabama, where you had 80% blacks and 20% whites. Black people were all over the place. How could you separate them from anything? The point is that what the system required was a race protocol where all of the white people had to act like superiors whether they wanted to or not, and all the black people had to act like inferiors whether they wanted to or not. And Brown versus Board of Education just simply did not deal with that problem at all. And so when black students went into the integrated and the desegregated schools, what they found themselves with is what John Marshall Harlan said in the first place in 1896, and that is what they found was a curriculum of white supremacy. And that's how the Portland case started. Because after Portland integrated, the parents found that their children were in worse shape in the integrated school than they had been in the segregated school. And they demanded that the curriculum of white supremacy be dismantled. And that's where we are. That's where we have come. We have come to that point that now is the time that we must dismantle the curriculum of white supremacy. We must dismantle the white supremacy control of black education. White supremacy has controlled the content and the process of black education in the modern world. And those of us who are in the movement understand that we have to change it at this time. There is no alternative to changing it. That is, it's no longer a matter of compromise. It's no longer a matter of adjustment. It's a matter of radically changing the system. Let's look at the current situation. What has happened? Where are we? What I would say is that we are on the brink of victory. We have arrived at a position where we can see that victory is imminent. But let us be very careful, because this is the most dangerous position to be in. Because too many times we have snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Too many times. You get right at the point where you can see, as Martin Luther King said, the promised land, and you miss it by a mile. And so we have to be very, very careful. We know that we are on the brink of victory because Arthur Schlesinger Jr. is attacking us. Because the defenders of Western civilization are spending a lot of time trying to disprove what we're talking about. We know we're on the brink of victory because they are hurting. And we can look into what they have said and find that they are desperate, that they aren't logical and cool as they try to protect themselves against what we're talking about and what we're putting forth. So we know that we're on the brink of victory by looking at the enemy. We know that we're on the brink of victory because they are offering us compromises. They come to us and they say, hey, look, we understand, we hear you, and we for you, and let's get together, let's stop all of this divisiveness and so forth and so on. Let's come on and get together under multiculturalism. You know, we can make a lot of strides and so forth and so on. We know that we're on the brink of victory. But let us understand why we are winning. We aren't winning because Schlesinger is fighting us. We aren't winning because some of the foundations are offering us compromises. That isn't why we're winning. That's just some symptom of our winning. The reason we are winning is because we have begun to get the minds of the African American people. The people who are demanding this turn to the African-centered curriculum are the parents, the community, and more the children themselves. It is because we have a mass movement going here, and it caught them by surprise. In 1987, ASCAC, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, took 1,000 African Americans to Kemet, to the Nile Valley, to Aswan, Egypt. When we dropped out of the sky, the whole world paid attention to it. It buzzed around the world. Everybody was in Egypt, was concerned about it. Where did these people come from? What do you want? What are you doing? What's going on? The Egyptian FBI was all over the conference. The USA Diplomatic Corps was trying to find out what was going on. They didn't have any idea. They thought that only a few crackpots were a part of this. But when they looked, they saw doctors, lawyers, plumbers, dentists, housewives. They saw African American people, the full complement. That's why we are winning. And so what we have to understand is that we are winning because the minds of African American people have decided that they're going to be free, that they're going to finally break those shackles that are on the mind, and they're going to start dealing with the truth instead of buying that that distorted vision of Africa that grows out of the campaign to commit historicide on African people, to destroy African history. They have decided that the truth is going to prevail. But what we have to see in the attempt on the part of the system to protect itself, the defenders of Western civilization, what we have to see is, again, what is going on all over the world where African people are going on. If you look at South Africa, you can understand a great deal about what's going on here. Because as I pointed out, South Africa got their model from this country, not the other way around. South Africa got their model. Apartheid is a copy of segregation. That's where they got it. And when they took it in 1948, it was about crumbling in this country. But they are still looking to the United States for a model of how to get out of apartheid. That is, they know apartheid has to go in the form that it's in, and they're trying now to figure out how they can get out of it. You know, once you get on the tiger's back, you know, you can have the heck of a ride, but sometimes you got to figure out how you're going to get off without getting ate up. So that's the problem. And what they are trying to do, and we have to understand that, what they're trying to do in South Africa is to save as much white supremacy as they can. You understand? If they can save one drop of white supremacy, they are still in good shape. You know? One drop. If they could get one concession, they are in good shape. So they're trying to get as many concessions as they can, and we have to understand that about what's going on in this country too, as we get ready. In other words, what I would point to is that we cannot afford to compromise. At this point, we're on the brink of victory, and the worst enemy that we have is the tendency of African people to compromise, because we lose every time we go into compromise. We lose. We don't have to compromise, because what we are talking about is good not just for African American people, it's good for everybody. Because what we're talking about is the truth. And the truth will liberate everybody. So we don't have to apologize for the African centered curriculum. What we need to do is to be comfortable in the knowledge that when the rest of the world wakes up, it will find that the African centered curriculum may be a model that can help save the world. Because when you look at the world, when you look at what is going on in the world, let's get out of Africa for a minute. Let's get out of the United States for a minute. Let's go to Europe and look at what is happening in Europe. What you see if you properly read Europe, what you see is a cultural revolution going on in Europe that suppressed cultures that have been suppressed for 75 years, cultures that have been oppressed in many cases for 150 years, are now demanding some kind of cultural autonomy. And the old formula of nationalism and so forth and so on, those formulas are not working anymore. Those people are tearing each other up, and to a large extent, it is a cultural warfare. It is because the solution to cultural difference in the past has been despotic. The nation has just simply risen up and crushed out cultural variety in too many cases. And what we're going to have to do now is find a way to have societies that are truly multicultural. Not just simply a kind of quilt work of exotic little cultures that are all subservient to one dominant culture, but cultures that are truly respected as equals. That's what we're going to have to move toward. And the African-centered curriculum movement is a model for that, if we don't compromise. We can provide a model for the world. So that's why we are so convinced that we're headed in the right direction, and so determined that we're not going to stop until we have total victory. unconditional surrender, so to speak. How much time do let me finally go over, some of you, I understand, have looked at the African Foundation's guidelines for the African-centered curriculum that we developed at the Kemetic Institute. I would like to go over those with you very briefly in closing, because I think that they offer us a way to think about this African-centered movement that may be constructive. In the first place, we believe that today, in many of the cities of this country, there ought to be a relatively large number of schools that have the option of adopting an African-centered curriculum, and that is organizing the entire curriculum from an African perspective. We believe that that is necessary to carry out the curriculum revolution, and it is necessary to make sure that those who claim to be moving in the direction of multiculturalism actually do so. Because until you have a power base, you aren't talking about anything. And the African-centered curriculum can give a power base to those schools that opt for it. So that's what we are advocating. We're not saying that every school ought to have an African-centered curriculum, but we feel that every school will benefit from some schools having African-centered curriculum, and that all schools will teach more effectively about Africa as well as other places and other cultures if we do have such. If you, though, have an African-centered curriculum, we feel that you must abide by 7 guidelines at least. There are probably more, but these are the ones that we emphasize, and let me share them with you. First of all, Africa speaking for itself through its literature, its oral traditions, its documents, and other primary data. One of the things that we can say is that in the past, Africa has been spoken for by others. Africa has not been allowed to speak for itself. The real problem in teaching correctly about Africa is not just that too little is taught about Africa, although that may be a problem. The real problem is that what is taught about Africa is wrong. It's wrong in context. And that is primarily due to the fact that Africa has seldom been allowed to speak for itself. But now that we know that Africans wrote from the beginning of history, Africans developed traditions of intergenerational communication, the oral tradition that has been preserved even down to until today, we know how to get at the African way of thinking and the African way of speaking, and so we ought to use that to the maximum in terms of developing the African curriculum. Secondly, we must present Africa as a continuous component of world history with a full complement of political, social, economic, and cultural dimensions. One of the problems that we confront in the treatment of Africa nowadays, even when Africa is treated, and some believe much better than it was in the past, you find that Africa ducks in and out of history. There are long periods when there's nothing about Africa at all. What does that mean? That Africa disappeared? What does it mean? African people were alive every minute of history. African people were experiencing history every minute, just like English people. You know that? African people knew what was going on in Europe in the 1300s. African people were working geometry in the 1500s. In parts of Africa that Europeans had never seen or heard of. Africans have experienced history like everybody else, and we can construct a world history from an African perspective, just like you can do one from Oxford. Third, Whenever Africa is taught about, it must be presented with balance. That is, everybody looks at Africa as a society that is primarily agricultural or pastoral. That's all right. But you must understand that Africa is also urban, has always been urban. Africans developed cities before the Greeks were a people. You must teach not only that Africa has a great oral tradition, but Africa has great written traditions. You must teach that Africa has not only problems, and that's about the only view of Africa you get today, contemporary Africa, but Africa also has good stories. You'd be surprised at what goes on in Africa. Not everybody in Africa is starving. Not everybody in Africa is in a war zone. There are people in Africa who go to church. There are people in Africa who go to work every day and come home and deal with their children and their families. But you would never know it from the way Africa is treated. And so we must do it with balance. We must show that Africa has problems and prospects, that Africa has antiquity as well as contemporary events. Fourthly, Africa must be taught in a comparative framework at all times. We are not talking about teaching only about Africa. In my view, African people don't know enough about Europe. So I'm certainly not saying teach less about Europe. I'm saying teach more about Europe. We need to know more about Europe. The problem is that, for the most part, we learn the wrong things about Europe. We need to know much more about Europe. We need to know much more about Asia. It is simply a crime to teach about Africa and nothing else, just as it ought to be a crime to teach about Europe and nothing else. So we are saying that it must be multicultural, but what we are saying is true multiculturalism and not this white supremacy multiculturalism. Fifth, and this is the one that is the most controversial, race specificity. Africans did not invent race the way we experience it. If you had asked me, or my grandfather for that matter, whether race ought to be invented in the sense that we use it today, we would have said no. Don't invent it. It is a very dangerous idea. It is detrimental to humanity. We would have stopped it dead in its tracks if we had had that power. But race is here nonetheless. And it has done tremendous damage to humanity. But now that it has begun to turn around, let us not completely abandon it until we have rehabilitated those people who have been debased because of it. Specifically, I'm talking about ancient Africa. It's all right to say, you know, why look at the ancient Egyptians from the perspective of the way we look at people nowadays? They didn't think like we think. That's all right. But if you're going to accuse me of being black, you're going to have to accuse the ancient Egyptians of being black. As long as black is relevant, then the ancient Egyptians were black. And we can't get up off of that. We have to convince the world. Nobody raises the question about the whiteness of the Greeks, although that could be a very legitimate question. If you look at some of the pictures they painted themselves, some of them as black as I am. But nobody thinks anything of the Greeks but that they were white. So we're going to have to insist that those ancient builders of civilization were black people. And we're going to have to teach that until one day there's a world where maybe people don't pay attention to those things. That's a long way away. Sixth, we must teach about Africa not just in social studies, not just in language arts, not just in art, and not just in music. We must teach about Africa also and especially in the sciences, in mathematics. You can go from pre-kindergarten through post-PhD with degrees in physics all the way up and never have learned that one scientific or mathematical idea is associated with any African or with Africa at all. Talk to some of the PhDs in physics if you don't believe what I'm saying. They think you crazy if you mention Africa. What are you talking about? Physics. But we have to teach it in every discipline. And seventh, let me use my language, because the way I have it here on this piece of paper is it doesn't really get at what I mean. So excuse my grammar. Don't tell no lies about Africa. Don't tell no lies about Africa. You don't have to. What we're talking about is the truth. We are trying to promote truth across the board, and we don't want any lies. So don't invent anything about Africa. All you do by inventing something is create another problem. You may think you're doing good to build Africa up, but you're not doing good. We will take Africa as Africa is and was. We don't have any problem with understanding that some Africans sold some other Africans, my great-great-grandpa, into slavery. We don't have any problem with that. Some Africans are still selling some Africans into slavery right now in Chicago. I know not Philadelphia. But Anglo-Saxons sold Anglo-Saxons into slavery too. You know, just to, keep it straight. These are the guidelines that we use to evaluate whether a curriculum is going in the right direction. We think these guidelines are good not only for teaching about Africa. We think they're good for teaching about Hispanics, Asians, Europeans, the natives of the Western Hemisphere, or whoever. And therefore, we commend them for your consideration. Let me finally read one of the statements of inspiration that I like to share with people that I talk with. This statement was written by Edward Wilmot Blyden, who went to Egypt in 1873. And the experience that he had in Egypt is very much like the experience we have every year as we take hundreds of people to Egypt. He said, in reference to his visit to the pyramid, "While standing in the central hall of the pyramid, I thought of the lines of Hilary Teague, the Liberian poet, when urging his countrymen to noble deeds. From pyramidal hall, from Karnak's sculptured wall, from Thebes they loudly call, retake your fame. This, thought I, is the work of my African progenitors. Teague was right. They had fame, and their descendants should strive by nobler deeds to retake it. Feelings came over me far different from those which I have felt when looking at the mighty works of European genius. I felt that I had a peculiar heritage in the Great Pyramid. The blood seemed to flow faster through my veins. I seemed to hear the echo of those illustrious Africans. I seemed to feel the impulse from those stirring characters who sent civilization into Greece. I felt lifted out of the commonplace grandeur of modern times, and could my voice have reached every African in the world, I would have earnestly addressed him in the language of Hilary Teague. Retake your fame. Thank you. That was it. Okay, that was it. You want to ask a question?
I think it's very, very important that we end this session by referring back to something I said earlier. And that is that we are now beginning to add some foundation to what we mean when we talk about African-centered education. What you got in the first 3 lectures was what we call putting the frame on the house. And now we're going to start filling it in. I think we really have to give General Elder Jake another hand, because what he gave us tonight is the beginning of what will really liberate us. And on behalf of the officers, I like to say, General, job well done.
Thank you. 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 Okay.
You know, the interesting point is that this debate about African-centered education scares some folk. And it is really interesting to me that it scares folk who say that they're about truth. And Jake talked about Arthur Schlesinger. And I am ever reminded of a quote that he said on the last page of the book. He made the statement that we don't necessarily have to believe that our culture is better than the next guy's or the next nation. And I'm paraphrasing. But he said it is better for us, reared as we are. It is rooted in our national traditions and our national documents and our folklore, and for that reason, we need to be willing to live by it and die for it. And I think that if we're going to move forward, we need to understand the mindset of folk, and I think let me just put it to you this way. There are a lot of us who critique our Jewish brothers and sisters. And I said to someone the other day that I think what we ought to do is not to critique them negatively, but to learn some of their traits and learn some of their characteristics. And I think that if we take something from that, we will learn that it's very, very important to teach our heritage. It is very, very important to control our communities. It is very, very important that we take responsibility for educating our children. And it is very, very important that we never, ever let our culture and heritage die. If we can take those traits, I think that they would add to this movement in a way that is very, very powerful. Having said that, let me field a couple questions to Elder Jake, and then we're going to get him out because he really has to get some rest before he gets in tomorrow.
Yeah, I thank you for giving us the information that you brought us. My question to you is in reference to a book that was brought to my attention from one of my ancestors. It's called The Rise and Progress of the Kingdom of Light and Dark. You gave reference to some things that I had read in this book when you were talking about the Quaker, Benjamin, and how how he laid out a foundation for the liberation, quote unquote liberation of the African Americans, and how he said it was an abomination of sorts. This book itself was published, I would say, in 1867. The author being Lorenzo D. Blacksmith, and he gave a very intricate detail of the conditions. And this was published in Christiana, Delaware. My question is, from the information that you've given me, could it very well be possible that this was one of the books that you used to design his statement that he brought to the
That who used
Benjamin?
Franklin in 1790?
No, no. Oh, I'm getting my time.
Right, okay.
He said something about 1890.
Yeah, what I was dealing with was just pointing out that if you look at the some of the critical events
In terms of the development of the policy of this country concerning African people, that is, people of African ancestry in this country, the 90s are interesting times. That is, we have 1790, during the first government of this country. There was a concern over the slave issue. And then in 1890, there was a concern over, as we said, the Negro question. And now we're in the 1990s, and I was just pointing out that that there is a concern here. We haven't articulated it as well as it was articulated in the previous 2 centuries. But it's interesting to look at history that way. So I don't know. I haven't read the book that you are referring to, unfortunately, so I really can't comment on it.
Somebody else?
Did someone? Oh, yes. Yes, ma'am.
On Sunday at my church, I had Black History program there, and he was speaking about Richard Allen, and I have a question, because it's what I'm trying to find out for the youth at my church as well as myself. I know that the Mother Bethlehem AME Church, first one, located 419 South 6th Street, and I also know that Richard Allen body is entombed there in the basement. But adjoining that, there is a room there that keeps the original pulpit. Do you know whether or not that is locked off, or do they allow observers?
They allow.
I've been there, but that was several years ago. They in 1776, I was in there when you had the bicentennial celebration. Yeah. So I don't know whether they've closed it. Does anybody know?
Yeah, they allow you to.
They still do?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I don't have a question, but I do have an idea concerning a couple of statements you were making. You're talking about the historically Black colleges, and I know you gave a point of reference to them. There is another point of reference, however, that I feel we would be remiss if we left without this being pointed
Sure.
out. Having been a product of a historically Black college, private college, I want us to understand that those colleges played a tremendously important part in the evolutionary and revolutionary aspect of civil rights in this country. Because many, as you pointed out, with the Black students in the era,
Sure.
it came from those colleges. I was fortunate enough to be an undergraduate student and a graduate student at the same, current time. And I will never forget the experience. In fact, my today's posturing is as a result of the experiences learned by mentoring
Sure.
and actual involvement in the civil rights process.
Sure.
And the Black kids of this country, especially Southern Black kids, made a difference in what we experience all over this country.
Sure. Oh, yes, I agree wholeheartedly with you, and I'm sorry that I didn't emphasize that more. But certainly the Black studies, the Black student revolution was a revolution that came out of the traditionally Black college. I also went to, in fact, I got my first 2 degrees in Black colleges. And my students, I was a beginning college student, teacher, when the Black student revolution broke out. And my students educated me. I was in a Black college teaching, and I had all of this European attitude toward my students, and those students went out. I thought they were the worst students in the world. but they went out and demonstrated and got put in jail. And some of them stayed in jail a month, and they came back to class, and they were different students, and they educated me. So yes, I agree. In addition to that, may point out that in terms of my role models, all of my early role models came out of the black college tradition. My professors, I can name a few of my professors that were really great. I think, though, that what we can say is that the excellence that we see coming out of those universities and colleges was in spite of the segregation system rather than because of it, because you had so many excellent people who came through those institutions and refused to buckle in and kept on doing what they knew was correct. And so I thank you for reminding me that I didn't place enough emphasis on that. Yes, ma'am. Yes, we got 1, 2. I don't know who was first. Yes, sir.
You spoke about some of the education, the curriculum, I guess must have been around the early 18th century. Maybe before that of how the European was giving the Negro the basis was just the Bible and
English language, right.
would that explain today why we have so many preachers in our community?
It explains to a large extent why we have so many teachers and preachers among our leaders, because there was a heavy reliance in the segregation system on leadership that was under the control of the white educational establishment. That's the way it worked. When they wanted to know what was going on in the black community, they called the principal. What's going on with your people? You know, I hear your people did such and such thing. I want you to look into that. You know, that sort of thing. So yes, that was a part of the system of control. You see, the old plantation system had seers and drivers to control the masses. But the new system had to have an educated elite to control it. And it was a very, very interesting system. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to know, Dr. Carruthers, do you do any types of staff development for schools, like open schools? We need some type of training, staff development in order to develop the African-centered curriculum.
Sure, we have a program. The Kemetic Institute has a program we call African Foundations, and we have assisted about 24 schools to develop strategies for the African-centered curriculum. It's a 45-hour program. We meet 3 hours a week for 15 weeks, and we give the participants. We like to take entire faculties of schools, because we feel that you can't do this on an individual basis. You have to do it on a collective basis. So we get the entire faculty of a school, and we take them through the program. And we've had what we think is some significant success with that approach. We have some schools that are doing an outstanding job of developing an African-centered curriculum. We don't give them an African-centered curriculum, but we give them a framework that enables them and helps them and assists them in developing one. You have to have the desire to do it. If you have the will to do it, you can do it. And we try to assist in developing that will that we feel is latent in teachers who are truly dedicated. That is, one of the things that we have to insist on is that the African-centered curriculum isn't going to solve all of your problems. One of the things that the African-centered curriculum certainly isn't going to do is take the place of good teaching. You have to have good teaching. You have to have good teachers and good teaching. If you don't have those, I don't care what kind of curriculum you have, you're going to have a disaster. So what we try to do is try to allow to create a framework where good teachers can really be good teachers and not get frustrated by the problems that they confront with trying to communicate and reach the real needs of the people that they are charged with responsible for. Okay.
You want to end it?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And make sure you sign the file, please.
Thank you. Thank you.